So you guys know that the Democrats are very likely to win the elections in 2026 and 2028, right? That's why everybody's really been talking about this abundance agenda, this book that has been published recently and that has been pushed by Ezra Klein at the New York Times and Derek Thompson at The Atlantic. That's what folks are really talking about. Donald Trump, at the very moment this is being published, seems to be going through like kind of a dead cat bounce of approval ratings. But as we saw in his first term, by the midterms in 2026, and certainly by the next presidential election in 2028, his rank and competence, frankly, just unbalancedness will eventually tell, as it did in the COVID crisis of 2020, and we're likely to see, even if the Democrats change nothing, we're likely to see Democratic landslides. Of course, if that Democratic success is going to last any longer than the brief fart of the Joe Biden administration, they actually need to have something a little more compelling. And also, the 2020 Democratic electoral victory could have been much, much bigger if they had anything to sell other than the geriatric guy and his obviously, chosen for being a woke choice vice president. So it's really important, actually, like for the future of the country and the world, that the Democrats come up with a good answer, a good response to what the Republicans are doing, and frankly, like a good answer to the much bigger question of what is the United States going to be doing for the next 40 years or so? An answer as compelling, if not more compelling, than what FDR came up with in the 1930s that lasted until the 1970s, or what Ronald Reagan came up with in the 1980s that is currently petering out in Trumpian self-parody as we speak. So this is a really important question. Like the abundance thing isn't just it is absolutely an inter-democratic party squabble, but the stakes are much, much bigger than that. And I think at the outset, I think it's only fair to Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson to point out that this is not really what they intended abundance to be. What they intended, it takes months, if not years, to put together a book. And when these guys thought they were publishing in the spring or the late winter, early spring of 2025, they were fully expecting to be publishing into a fresh Democratic administration. And in a lot of ways, this abundance book, the agenda presented here, the kind of small ball, but very important things that they propose in this book, makes a lot more sense when you consider that it was supposed to be coming out in the first months of a fresh Biden administration or the Kamala Harris administration. I don't think this was really intended by the authors as the rallying cry of resistance and opposition to what Trump was doing. This was expected to be a rallying cry for some technocratic solutions that would move the party forward and help them maybe build up a little more legitimacy. So I think it is fair to point out that this was not what they had intended. I have read the book, and I have to say that this is, to my mind, this is a good local policy. This book applies, very importantly, should be read and internalized by every local Democratic Party or any party politician in the state of New York, in which I live, and the state of California. And certainly there are, with more limited application, there are applications for this in most urban environments in the city, some of the recommendations that they make. This is not a national policy. I don't think Klein or Thompson would have chosen this, but the people who are backing Klein and Thompson, Steve Jobs' money runs The Atlantic. The New York Times is deeply interweaved with a whole bunch of powerful rich people that bank Ezra Klein. The various institutes and NGOs that have been liberally funded to push the abundance agenda, the university departments. These folks really, really, really want to pick up this and use it as a machine against more left-oriented elements of the Democratic Party. And it is a bit absurd. I don't think we can blame Klein and Thompson for this, but we can certainly blame their wealthy supporters for this. It is quite absurd that this abundance agenda is being set in opposition to the anti-oligarch agenda of folks like Bernie Sanders and AOC. I think it's transparently obvious. In the months of March and April, it was an interesting contrast. You had Klein and Thompson going around on Jon Stewart's podcast and all the big shows, even on cable news and podcasts, this, that, and the other thing, giving their reasoned explanations of things, being really just shoved down our throats, while at the grassroots level, Sanders was touring not just blue states, also red states, and filling arenas for his message of the rich people are coming to kill us. And I think I've certainly never been historically sympathetic to the rich people are coming to kill us agenda, but if your eyes are open during the Trump administration and watching most dramatically the actions of Elon Musk, but certainly a lot of other lower level things, much more effective actors than Elon Musk who are working more quietly. Yes, it's transparently obvious that the rich people are coming to kill us. And like that oligarch message with an enemy actually works. It's something that the Democratic Party could be viable under on a national level. That is the pathway, I've been convinced, to long-term success for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party's, that's only part of it, but that's sort of the starting necessary part of the Democratic Party building up the power behind it that it might need to set the new next era, like FDR or Reagan. Abundance is not going to do it. I've read the book. I've got a variety of things to say about it, but it's filled with incredibly useful not policies, because there's not a lot of policy in here, but incredibly useful guidance for the New York City Council, for the New York State Legislature, for the California Legislature. Everyone in those bodies should read this book. This is not going to get anybody excited. In fact, even among my very intelligent audience, I doubt that this video is going to get people very excited, because the main thing that this is about is zoning regulations. It's about the attempt to get government out of the way of business, which is not a new message. And that's sort of the fundamental thing here, is like the fundamental message of this. There's certainly a lot of lip service paid to other approaches and saying, of course government's useful. We're liberals, we're Democrats, we think government is sometimes useful. But the fundamental message and push of this is the same Reaganite deregulation that we've been hearing for 40 years. And it's sort of a last gasp of a dying approach. And that's sort of why it's being pushed. I actually talked about the main policy implementation policy suggestion of this book in a podcast a couple months back. So we'll roll that clip right now.
I actually found this book in one passage really, really helpful, because I am getting to a point where I'm like turning into like a total 2016 election changed me. I'm turning into like a total New Deal Democrat. I'm really suspicious of deregulation. People talking about deregulation. I think we probably in the United States need more like government intervention and regulation and whatnot. But at the same time, and these things can be true at the same time, I've gotten really interested in housing policy in the United States. And it's clear to me that one of the biggest problems throughout the country is environmental regulation around housing. Not like saying you have to build this in a certain way that's cleaner or you can't pollute. That's all great. It's a specific national policy called NEPA. I think it's the National Environmental... Yeah, the National Environmental Policy Act passed in 1970. And this created a system that is embellished. It's bad enough for the whole country, but it's actually embellished in certain blue states like New York and California. I think there's 7 states that add their own state versions of this. And it basically creates eternal processes to build any significant infrastructure.
Is this the sort of NIMBYism? Or what's the other one? Bananas don't build anything anywhere?
Well, yes, yeah. So it's basically, it's the sword of NIMBYism. has been this national NEPA policy.
Would it have
and
been
then,
when it first was brought in? Do you think it made sense, but now it's just been slowly expanded upon to basically just be used as a don't build anything weapon?
I think it was an interesting idea that actually very quickly proved to be a bad one, but people liked it too much. NIMBYs liked it too much and worked too hard to keep it, that it's now been the law of the land for over 50 years. But what it means in practice, I don't know if you know the congestion pricing kerfluffle in New York City. Did you hear about that?
Well, I've heard the way the London does it is right, and New York's sort of done it completely mad, and it's not really working well.
No, it's working amazingly well.
Okay.
That's just the
Oh,
propaganda.
I'm getting all the American biased media telling me that.
Yes, yeah. So, well, the thing is, Rory, we've been talking and arguing about congestion pricing in New York City for 15 years. It started, I think, 3 weeks ago.
Wow, because I think it's been in London for maybe 20 years now, to some degree.
Yeah, and it was a rousing success in London, and we started trying to do it. And basically, because of NEPA and the New York State version, basically everybody who had any kind of interest, basically anybody in New York who wanted to drive into work and not pay a toll could start a court case. So this is a bad piece of regulation. It should be deregulated. It should be done away with, or at least changed massively. But the thing is, that's just one thing. But it was confusing to me. I was like, you know what? Every day I become more and more pro-regulation. But the one regulation that comes up a lot in my study of New York politics and my study of housing is this bad regulation that I want to get rid of.
So I've played a little bit of a trick on you guys here, but I think it's a illustrative trick or an educational trick. Everything that I talked about there, NEPA, the need to remove those regulatory strictures, what have you, are very real. That discussion is very real. That is very much at the heart of abundance. However, that podcast was not talking about the abundance book. That podcast was talking about a book I read earlier this year, which is Taking Back Washington to Save America, which is by Kevin D. Roberts, the guy in charge of the Heritage Foundation. So basically, abundance, these guys on really some basic fundamentals agree with the Project 2025 people. And I think that's a little unfair. I mean, I'd say probably like Klein and Thompson would hate like, I don't know, 60% of what's in this book. But that 40% is they're directly in line. And I think that's why abundance fails on a national level. It is very much just like this Heritage Foundation campaign book for Donald Trump. It's just old wine in new bottles on the national level. On the local level, again, this is vitally important for a lot of Democratic legislators, and they should be reading it. But on the national level, it's really just libertarianism for the Democratic Party. That is fundamentally what Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are offering here.
So this is like a really clarifying thing, because this is a book that's completely dedicated to deregulation. And I was not surprised at all that he has 2 solid pages talking about NEPA, talking about these environmental report requirements and legislation requirements and how bad they are. But there's this really helpful paragraph to me that helped clarify just the relationship of NEPA to the broader deregulatory movement. He says, NEPA is the tip of the iceberg. But a recent analysis by the Foundation for American Innovations, highlighted other regulations that impose subtler costs, including the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and above all, the Clean Air Act of 1970. During the Trump administration, the Department of Commerce polled American manufacturers about the specific regulations they viewed as most burdensome. NEPA didn't even make the top 10. So the deregulation movement loves to talk about NEPA because NEPA is a legitimately stupid.
But would you say that it's quite common for the average American to dislike this?
Of course, and because it's idiotic. It's clearly a problem, and it is only preserved because it gives every individual American the potential to stop So I think everybody hates NEPA everywhere except in their own neighborhood where they get to use NEPA. So, but it's an acknowledged evil. It's obviously stupid and wrong, is obviously bad for the country. And there's a 2-page description of how bad it is. That's the only regulation that actually gets described in this book. And I think this is a more democratic leading libertarians like Ezra Klein or Matt Iglesias who talk about NEPA as well. And everybody agrees NEPA is bad. And I think that's really interesting. And it's a rhetorical trick that's very educational. And this guy kind of gives the game away. Like NEPA is what everybody who wants to talk about deregulation talks about at great length. But it's like not even the 10th most important thing that the deregulation people actually want to do away with. So they'll talk about NEPA, which everybody hates, when they really want to get rid of the Clean Air Act. They really want to get rid of the Clean Water Act. And that was just helpful to me personally for the Heritage Foundation guy to sort of like drop the curtain on that. It's like, oh, no wonder I'm so confused about like, wait, I feel like regulation's a good thing. Why do I think of NEPA whenever, because it's a rhetorical trick that's being used politically is you talk about NEPA, which is obviously stupid, to give power to people like Trump who wants to do away with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act.
It's it's libertarianism for the Democratic Party. And now, to be clear, like I think is it in this? I'm not sure if it was in the foregoing clip or the clip that's about to come. I make a big deal about the fact that these guys talk a lot about NEPA and then say, but we really want to move on to the other stuff. And you know what? Abundance does the exact same thing. On page 96, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, gets much of the attention here, but the problem is really the profusion of different overlapping policies and authorities. Beyond NEPA, Rule and Salmon note the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Clean Water Act, the Federal Land Policy Act and Management Land, and the National Forest Management Act are, things that also need to be revised or perhaps thrown out. And I think it's really telling that these, Republican Party and Democratic Party elite answers treat the issue of regulation, deregulation, re-regulation in fundamentally the same way. So these two answers, elite Republican and elite Democratic, are like fundamentally the same thing. It's just zombie Reaganism. And both of their answers are deregulation. It's much more carefully couched, and there's a veneer of wokeness and even like old callbacks to the idea that we might actually care about working people a little bit in this book. But I found one passage on page 153 just really instructive in a really basic way, because it sort of I think gets at the heart of what Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein really think. As science funding became more entrenched inside the federal government, politicians did what they do best. They created paperwork. Well, in fact, and this book has a lot of acknowledgement of this, what politicians did was create a massive infrastructure to fund science and progress that revolutionized the United States and the world. They did not, in fact, just create paperwork. But for Klein and Thompson, what politicians do best is not get as close to a cancer cure as we have thus far, get as close to an HIV cure as we have thus far, get us to the moon, do any number of other things. No, what politicians do best is create paperwork. This is just zombie Reaganism, is what this is. And these are smart guys, but they grew up in the same context that I grew up in, and unlike me, they're not out by themselves with a silly little YouTube channel. They are folks who are at the halls of power and have worked very hard and intelligently to situate themselves in the halls of power. So they aren't able to see the message, the very clear message that 2016 provided, which is that, oh wait, we need to move on from Reaganism. And they're just very, very mired in those ideas and those ideologies. Much of this book is taken up telling the story of, this is another crime against her legacy because I can't remember or pronounce her name at this point, but the extraordinary Hungarian-American woman who was the champion of mRNA technology and for years labored in obscurity. And the story that Klein and Thompson want to get is a story that I've heard over and over and over again, which is she labored in obscurity, and thank gosh for BioNTech and Moderna, these heroic private sector folks that put money behind this mRNA technology, or otherwise we'd never have had vaccines for COVID. And you can tell that story, and it's not like entirely wrong, but you're also like not emphasizing the basics of what actually happened, which is, yes, she labored in obscurity at great affront to her her professional career. She's a hero. She's absolutely to be rewarded. But what happened in the 1990s is she met a fellow scientist at a photocopier who did have access to federal funding streams. We have mRNA vaccines because of papers that those two scientists were able to put together under massive federal government funding. And I see that over and over again. There's like a passage in here like, before the 20th century, the federal government had nothing to do with science. And it's like, yeah, another thing that's kind of true, but if you actually dive into how things were actually invented, things actually happened, you find that that's not the case. There's a sentence here, it's like, all they invested in was agriculture before the 20th century and defense. And it's like, well, yeah, like agriculture and defense were like most of our economy before the 20th, or rather agriculture was most of our economy before the 20th century. Like it's this weird narrative that I get because I was raised in that as well, that like, government didn't really matter for science and innovation. And it's frankly it's not true. It's nonsense. My family is deeply rooted in New England manufacturing and what's called the American system of manufacture, sort of standard parts switched in and out. That genesis of that whole like American manufacturing industry is contracts for rifles for the U.S. military in the 19th century. Railroads, the proving ground of most of the more impressive technological innovations of the 19th century. Railroads, the telegraph wires, communications, that revolutionized everything, were funded by land grants from the U.S. government. Like, government has never been outside of the idea of innovation. And Klein and Thompson just can't see out of, much smarter guys than I am, can't see out of the thought environment in which they get their paychecks. And that just comes throughout this book. So I think it's important to point out that I don't just believe that this is not going to be sold well on a national level. It's an electoral loser. It just doesn't, like zoning regulations. Like, no, we want to fight billionaires. We don't want to talk about bureaucratic minutia in trying to make the case electorally. I also think it would fail as a practice because fundamentally we've been doing abundance, or what I believe to be at the core of what abundance wants, for 40 years now. Because at the core of what abundance wants is deregulation. Of course, if you've read this book, you're like, no, that's not just what these guys are saying. These guys are making carefully nuanced points in really clever arguments and great cherry-picked examples from U.S. history and U.S. bureaucratic history, and the CHIPS Act might not have worked because of this, that, and the other thing. And you're totally right. And I think that Klein and Thompson don't really believe that abundance is just about deregulation. But you have to understand, like, it's the ideas here that they're putting forward, the policies they're putting forward here are mostly intelligent deregulation, whereas this is like more nuclear deregulation. But like in practice, it's always going to be nuclear deregulation, or at least with the current set of politicians that we have right now. I mean, Elon Musk fundamentally is doing the abundance agenda in a lot of places. He's doing it poorly. He's doing it insanely. But that's kind of what would actually happen. You have the Democrats, you have sort of like nuanced sales and then battle axe interpretation. And I think that's what would be likely to happen. Now, I'm not saying that all deregulation is evil. I'm absolutely not saying that. What we need is nuance, not just nuance in carefully presenting the case for deregulation, but nuance in actual policy implementation. There are absolutely places in the U.S. economy, NEPA would be a phenomenal example of that, perhaps the main example of that, probably not the only example, where deregulation is absolutely necessary. I think there are many, many, many other areas where re-regulation is necessary. Joe Weisenthal of Bloomberg, one half of the amazing Odd Lots podcast, did a great review of the Abundance book that I would highly recommend. And just sort of one thing that he pointed out is like, we don't live in a miracle world of nuclear power because of too much regulation. We don't live there because of deregulation, because energy markets made it impossible. The deregulation of energy markets, the idea that prices all had to float all the time and be market based, is the reason we can't build nuclear plants anymore. It's among other reasons. Like the abundance agenda makes a lot of sense when you're talking about the basics of why can't we build transmission lines. It also makes a little less sense, but a lot of sense when we talk about supply of housing and the housing crisis. But then when you apply it to more and more things, it makes less and less sense. And Joe Weisenthal's review of this book, which I'd highly recommend, points that out in a very useful way. So we need we need deregulation in some places. We need re-regulation in other places. But what this is yet another blunderbuss in the deregulatory direction. And God, that is not what we need right now. Absolutely, we need to reform or entirely get rid of NEPA. We do not need to then move on to the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the, this, that, and the other thing. Deregulation, zoning reform is not the answer to everything, nor is it an answer that is likely to win elections, frankly. Not saying this is a bad book. And frankly, I think as a New Yorker that this is kind of, there are folks running in the mayoral race who are supported by rich people who have put together an abundance network. They are advocating these ideas, and I think that's a great idea, actually. I think, honestly, the Bernie AOC model, which I would like to be very successful with the Democratic Party on the national level, is not very well suited to New York right now. Because, honestly, if they're successful on the national level, I would hope that would involve some, not killing, but certainly some slimming down of the golden goose of Wall Street and the finance industry through taxation, through breaking up of some of these monopolies. And I think that would just naturally mean less money for New York City, which is already suffering from the COVID-related decline in commercial real estate revenues. So there's a candidate called Zoran Mamdani, I think is his name, who is really making a huge push right now. Very attractive, very clever, does a great job, and is pushing a bunch of super hyper progressive policies that I don't think New York City or state is capable of paying for. So on the local level, I am not actually a big fan of Zoran Mamdani. I'll probably end up voting for him anyway because he seems to be the only mayoral candidate. Actually, no, I think maybe Adrian Adams did an okay job on this. I should put a little more research into it. But I may end up voting for Mamdani just because he's the guy who puts the most distance between himself and the genocidal state of Israel. But no, I don't think the city of New York needs more progressive policies right now. I think the city of New York needs an abundance agenda. It needs an agenda of zoning reform, deregulation, trying to figure out how to build things again. On the national level, we don't need this. On the national level, we've had too much of this, frankly. And we need to figure out how to make government work again for the people instead of for businesses that want to deregulate everything. Abundance, Amazing book for local policymaking in New York and California. 100% not a national policy that should be taken seriously. Hope that was helpful. And with that, I guess I'll say, yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and please consider signing up for our Patreon. If you do, you get 2 patrons-only presentations every month and access to the patrons-only Discord server. Thanks.